The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the New Mexico desert in the summer of 1885. Thomas Garrett wiped the sweat from his forehead as he rode his horse across the dusty landscape. The rancher had seen 48 summers in his life, and every single one had taught him something new about survival in this harsh land. Today wasn't supposed to be anything special. Thomas was just tracking his cattle. They had wandered off toward the eastern edge of his property again, and he needed to bring them back before they got too far. His ranch stretched across several thousand acres of rough terrain, full of dried creek beds, mesquite trees, and rocks that could break a horse's leg if you weren't careful. The land out here didn't forgive mistakes. Thomas had learned that the hard way over the years, but he loved it anyway. There was something honest about the desert. It never pretended to be anything other than what it was. As Thomas guided his horse toward a dried-up creek bed, something felt wrong. His horse, a reliable mare named Dusty, suddenly stopped and pulled back. Her ears flattened against her head and she snorted nervously. "Easy, girl," Thomas said, patting her neck. "What's got you spooked?" That's when he saw it. Under the twisted branches of an old mesquite tree, there was a shape that didn't belong. At first, Thomas thought maybe it was a dead animal. But as he got closer, his heart started pounding. It was a person. Thomas quickly dismounted and rushed over. It was a young girl, maybe 15 or 16 years old. She was Apache. He could tell from her clothing and the traditional items she wore. But something was terribly wrong. Her skin was burning hot with fever and her breathing came in short, painful gasps. The girl's clothes were torn in places and dirt covered her from head to toe. Her lips were so dry they had cracked and bled. Thomas could see strange markings on her arms, designs painted in colors that had mostly washed or rubbed away. She must have been out here for at least a day, maybe longer. Thomas felt his stomach tighten with worry. He knew this situation was dangerous in more ways than one. The Apache people and white settlers had been fighting for years. There had been raids, battles, and a lot of bloodshed on both sides. Most of his neighbors wouldn't hesitate to either leave an Apache to die or worse. And if he helped her, well, that could bring trouble from both sides. His fellow ranchers might call him a traitor, and the Apache might think he had hurt her, which could mean war paint and arrows raining down on his property. But as Thomas knelt beside the unconscious girl, watching her struggle to breathe, he knew he couldn't leave her. His mother had raised him to believe that some things were more important than politics or fear. A life was a life, no matter whose child this was. "Lord help me," Thomas whispered to himself. "This is either the best decision I'll ever make or the last one." He carefully lifted the girl into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, probably because she hadn't eaten properly in days. Her head rolled against his shoulder, and she made a small sound of pain but didn't wake up. Getting her onto his horse was tricky. Dusty was still nervous, dancing sideways and tossing her head. Thomas spoke quietly to calm her down while he positioned the girl in front of the saddle. He climbed up behind her, holding her steady with one arm while controlling the reins with the other. The ride back to his ranch house felt like it took forever. Every few minutes, Thomas checked to make sure the girl was still breathing. Her fever was so high that he could feel the heat radiating through her clothes. She mumbled words he couldn't understand. Apache words that sounded urgent and frightened. Thomas thought about what might have brought her out here alone. Apache girls didn't usually travel by themselves, especially not this far from any known camps. Something bad must have happened. Maybe she was running from something, or maybe she got separated from her family during a journey. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky by the time Thomas's ranch house came into view. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple wooden structure with a barn and a few outbuildings. But it was home, and right now it might be the only thing standing between this girl and death. Thomas had lived alone in that house for 3 years now. His wife had died from pneumonia one terrible winter, and he hadn't had the heart to change much since then. Her things were still where she'd left them, including the small collection of medical supplies she'd kept for emergencies. He carried the girl inside and laid her on the bed in the spare room. The room smelled like dust and old wood. Nobody had used it since his wife's sister visited 2 years ago. Thomas opened the window to let in some air, then went to fetch water and cloths. As he worked, cleaning the dirt from the girl's face and arms, he got a better look at those markings he'd seen earlier. They weren't wounds or bruises. They were ceremonial paintings, the kind Apache people used for important rituals. Some of the designs were still clear enough that Thomas recognized them as symbols he'd seen before during trading meetings. This girl wasn't just any Apache child. Those markings meant she was someone important, someone involved in sacred ceremonies. Thomas felt his worry deepen. If she was important to her tribe, they would definitely be looking for her. He soaked a cloth in cool water and placed it on her forehead, trying to bring down the fever. The girl's eyes moved rapidly beneath her closed lids like she was having intense dreams. Every few minutes she would cry out, thrashing weakly against the blankets. Thomas stayed by her side as the hours passed. He'd treated sick animals plenty of times, and he'd nursed his wife through her final illness. But this felt different. This girl's life wasn't just her own. It represented something bigger, something that could affect everyone in the territory. As midnight approached, he managed to get some water between her cracked lips. She swallowed reflexively but didn't wake up. Her breathing sounded wet and painful, and Thomas recognized the signs. She probably had pneumonia just like his wife had. Without proper medicine, she might not make it through the night. Thomas found himself praying, something he hadn't done much since his wife died. He wasn't even sure what he was praying for. That the girl would live? That her people wouldn't come for revenge? That somehow this would all work out? Around 3 a.m, something changed. The girl's fever seemed to break slightly. Her breathing became a little easier, and she stopped thrashing around. Thomas dozed in the chair beside the bed, exhausted but afraid to leave her alone. When dawn light started creeping through the window, Thomas stood up to stretch his aching back. He walked to the front door and stepped outside, breathing in the cool morning air. He needed to check on his horse and maybe start some coffee, but the moment he looked up at the horizon, every muscle in his body went rigid. There, on the ridge that overlooked his ranch, silhouetted against the rising sun, stood hundreds of Apache warriors on horseback. They sat perfectly still like statues watching his house. Thomas's blood ran cold. They had found her, and now they were waiting to see what he would do next. Thomas stood frozen on his porch, staring at the ridgeline. His heart hammered in his chest so hard he thought it might burst right through his ribs. The Apache warriors hadn't moved an inch. They just sat there on their horses, hundreds of them, watching and waiting. He forced himself to breathe slowly and think clearly. Panicking wouldn't help anyone, especially not the sick girl lying in his spare bedroom. Thomas counted the warriors as best he could from this distance. 200, maybe more. Some of them carried rifles, others had bows and arrows. Even at this distance, he could see the war paint on some of their faces, but they weren't attacking. That was the strangest part. They weren't charging down the hill or surrounding his property. They were just watching. Thomas realized with a chill what this meant. They knew the girl was here. Somehow they'd tracked her to his ranch, and now they were waiting to see if she would live or die. If she died while in his care, Thomas didn't need to guess what would happen next. Those warriors would sweep down from that ridge like an avenging storm, and there wouldn't be enough left of him or his ranch to fill a coffee cup. Thomas turned and walked back inside, his legs feeling shaky. The girl was exactly where he'd left her, lying still under the blankets. Her breathing sounded a bit better than before, but she was still unconscious. Her face looked so young and peaceful despite the fever that still colored her cheeks pink. "Well, little one," Thomas said quietly, even though she couldn't hear him. "Looks like your family came looking for you. Now we just need to make sure you wake up so I can give you back to them." He spent the next few hours doing everything he knew how to do. He changed the cool cloths on her forehead every 15 minutes. He tried to get more water into her mouth drop by drop. His wife had taught him that fever could kill you by drying you out from the inside, so keeping liquids in a sick person was crucial. Thomas also tried to get her to swallow some broth he'd made from dried beef. She managed a few spoonfuls in her unconscious state, which he counted as a victory. Every little bit might help her body fight whatever sickness had taken hold of her. As he worked, Thomas found himself talking to the girl, even though she couldn't hear him. Maybe he just needed to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. 3 years of living alone had made him comfortable with silence, but today the quiet felt oppressive. "My name's Thomas," he told her as he wrung out another cloth. "Thomas Garrett. I've been running this ranch for about 12 years now. It's not much, but it's honest work. My wife, she would have known better than me how to help you. She was good with healing, had a gentle touch and knew all sorts of remedies." The girl's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. She mumbled something in Apache, words that ran together in her fever. Thomas wished he understood more of the language. He'd picked up a few words over the years from trading with Apache bands that came through, but not enough to understand what she was saying. Every hour or so, Thomas would walk to the window and peek out at the ridge. The warriors never moved. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat increased, but those men sat on their horses like they were made of stone. Thomas couldn't imagine the discipline that took. His legs would have given out hours ago. He tried to eat some breakfast, but couldn't manage more than a few bites. His stomach was tied up in knots. The coffee helped, though. He drank cup after cup, knowing he needed to stay alert. There was no telling when something might change, when the girl might wake up, or when those warriors might decide they'd waited long enough. Around mid-morning, the girl's condition seemed to worsen again. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and the fever spiked higher. She started thrashing in the bed, crying out in her native language. Her arms flailed weakly, pushing away invisible threats. Thomas held her shoulders gently, trying to keep her from hurting herself. "Easy now," he said softly. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you." She didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes opened, but they didn't focus on anything. She was looking at things Thomas couldn't see, trapped in whatever fever dreams held her. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes and ran down into her hair. One word kept coming from her lips, over and over. It sounded like Sheeta or something similar. Thomas wondered if it was a name. Maybe her mother or father, maybe a sibling. Whoever it was, she called for them desperately, her voice breaking with need. I know, Thomas said, continuing to hold her steady. "You want to go home? Just hang on a little longer. Get strong enough to walk out of here, and I'll take you to them myself. I promise." It was a promise he hoped he could keep. Those warriors on the ridge made him nervous, but he understood why they were there. If his child was missing and possibly dying, he'd be sitting on that ridge too, watching and waiting for any sign. The afternoon dragged by slowly. Thomas measured time by the movement of shadows across the floor and the slow arc of the sun across the sky. He dozed off once or twice in his chair, but never for long. Every sound jerked him awake, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he'd propped against the wall. Not that the rifle would do him much good against 200 warriors, but it made him feel slightly less helpless to have it nearby. Around 3 in the afternoon, something changed. The girl suddenly went very still. For a terrifying moment, Thomas thought she'd stopped breathing entirely. He jumped up and leaned over her, his hand hovering near her face to feel for breath. Then she took a deep, shuddering breath. Her eyes opened, truly opened this time, and they focused on the ceiling above her. She blinked slowly, confusion clear on her face. Thomas stayed very still, not wanting to frighten her. He watched as she slowly became aware of her surroundings. Her eyes moved from the ceiling to the walls to the window. Then they landed on him. The girl's eyes went wide with fear. She tried to sit up quickly, but her body wasn't ready for that. She only managed to rise a few inches before falling back against the pillow with a gasp of pain and weakness. Thomas raised both his hands, palms out, in the universal gesture of peace. "Easy," he said gently. "You're safe. You were sick. I found you by the creek." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Thomas could see her mind working, trying to understand where she was and how she'd gotten here. She looked down at herself, seeing the clean blankets, noticing that someone had washed the dirt from her hands and face. The girl said something in Apache. Her voice came out rough and scratchy from fever and dehydration. Thomas shook his head apologetically. "I don't understand," he said. "I'm sorry. I don't speak Apache very well." He walked slowly to the table where he'd left a cup of water. Moving carefully so he wouldn't startle her, he brought it over and offered it to her. "Water," he said, pointing at the cup. She looked at the water, then back at his face. Thomas could see the war happening in her mind. She was clearly thirsty, but she didn't know if she could trust him. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then the girl reached out with a trembling hand and took the cup. She drank deeply, water spilling down her chin in her eagerness. When the cup was empty, she handed it back and said a single word in English. "More." Thomas felt relief wash over him. She spoke at least a little English. "That would help." He refilled the cup and gave it back to her. This time she drank more slowly, keeping her eyes on him the whole time. "My name is Thomas," he said, pointing at himself. "Thomas." The girl studied him for a moment. Then she touched her own chest and said, "Dahana." "Dahana," Thomas repeated, trying to get the pronunciation right. "That's a pretty name." She didn't smile, but some of the fear in her eyes lessened slightly. She looked around the room again, then tried once more to sit up. This time Thomas helped her, propping pillows behind her back so she could stay upright. Dahana said something in Apache, pointing toward the door. Thomas thought he caught the word for people or family, but he wasn't sure. "Your people are here," Thomas said, walking to the window. He pulled the curtain back slightly so she could see. "They're up on the ridge. They've been waiting for you." Dahana's face transformed. She said something that sounded joyful and relieved, but then tears started flowing down her cheeks. She tried to get out of bed, pushing the blankets away, clearly desperate to go to them, but her legs wouldn't hold her. The moment she tried to stand, they buckled underneath her, and she would have fallen if Thomas hadn't caught her. "Whoa there," he said, helping her back to the bed. "You're too weak still. Give yourself time." Dahana was crying openly now, frustrated and upset. She kept pointing toward the ridge and saying things Thomas couldn't understand, but he understood the feeling behind the words. She wanted to go home. She wanted her people to know she was alive. Thomas made a decision. "All right," he said. "We'll go outside. I'll help you. They need to see that you're okay." He found a blanket to wrap around her shoulders and then helped her to her feet. Supporting most of her weight, Thomas slowly walked her through the house and out onto the front porch. The afternoon sun made them both squint after being inside all day. Dahana lifted one shaking arm toward the ridge. She called out something in Apache, her voice weak but carrying in the desert air. Thomas held her steady, making sure those watching warriors could see that she was alive and being cared for. Thomas helped Dahana into a wooden chair on the porch. She was so weak that even sitting upright seemed to take all her strength. Her hands gripped the arms of the chair, and she kept her eyes fixed on the ridge where her people waited. The standoff continued. The Apache warriors remained motionless on the hilltop, a line of silent judgment stretching across the horizon. Thomas felt like he was being measured and weighed by 200 pairs of eyes, and he had no idea if he was passing or failing their test. He brought out another chair and sat down beside Dahana, making sure the warriors could see he meant no harm. Then he fetched water, blankets, and some dried fruit, tending to her in full view of everyone watching. If they were going to judge him, he wanted them to see exactly how he was treating their girl. Dahana tried to eat a piece of dried apple, but she could only manage a small bite before her stomach protested. She'd been too long without proper food. Thomas knew from experience that you had to ease back into eating after a fever like hers. "Slow," he said, making a gentle motion with his hand. "Small bites." She nodded, understanding his meaning even if she didn't know all the words. They sat together in silence for a while, the only sound being the occasional whinny of a horse from the ridge and the whisper of wind across the desert. Thomas studied the warriors more carefully now. He could make out more details in the daylight. Some were young men, probably not much older than 20. Others looked like they'd seen many seasons of war and peace. They all held themselves with a dignity that Thomas had to respect, even though he was terrified of what they might do. "Your father up there?" Thomas asked, pointing at the ridge. Dahana followed his gesture. Her expression became complicated, mixing several emotions that Thomas couldn't quite read. "Father," she repeated in English, then added something in Apache that sounded sad. She pointed to a figure near the center of the line. Even from this distance, Thomas could tell this man was different from the others. He wore more elaborate clothing, decorated with items that caught the sunlight. Feathers adorned his hair, and something about the way he sat his horse spoke of authority. "Medicine man?" Thomas gasped, remembering the ceremonial paintings on Dahana's arms. Her eyes widened in surprise that he'd figured it out. "Yes," she said. "Father, medicine man." That explained the paintings and why so many warriors had come looking for her. She wasn't just any girl. She was the daughter of someone important to the tribe, someone whose word carried weight in decisions and ceremonies. Thomas felt his worry deepen. He'd already known this situation was dangerous, but now he understood it was even more complicated than he'd thought. If anything happened to this girl, her father wouldn't just be a grieving parent. He'd be a leader whose honor and power had been challenged. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas noticed Dahana growing tired. The simple act of sitting outside was exhausting her. He helped her back inside and got her settled in bed again. She fell asleep almost immediately, her breathing now deeper and more regular than before. Thomas returned to the porch alone. He sat in his chair and stared up at the ridge, wondering what the warriors were thinking. Were they planning an attack? Waiting for a signal? Trying to decide if he could be trusted? His nearest neighbor was a man named Johnson, whose ranch lay about 10 miles to the west. Even if Thomas could somehow signal for help, Johnson and his hands wouldn't arrive for hours. And honestly, Thomas wasn't sure he wanted them to come. Johnson had lost a son to an Apache raid 5 years ago, and his hatred for the native people ran deep. Having him show up might make everything worse. No, Thomas realized. He was on his own in this. Whatever happened next would be between him, that sick girl sleeping in his spare room, and the 200 warriors watching his house. He went inside and tried to busy himself with normal tasks. He swept the floor, washed some dishes, checked on his horse, but his mind kept wandering back to the ridge. Every few minutes he'd find himself at a window, peeping out to make sure the warriors were still there. They never moved. As the sun traveled across the sky and shadows grew longer, those Apache men sat their horses like they'd grown roots into the ground. Thomas couldn't imagine the patience and discipline that required. His own legs were aching just from normal walking around. Evening came slowly. Thomas lit some lamps inside the house, and their warm glow spilled out through the windows. He checked on Dahana and found her still sleeping peacefully. Her fever seemed to be fully broken now, and color was returning to her cheeks. She would live. Thomas felt fairly certain of that. But what happened after she recovered? That was the question that kept him awake as darkness fell over the desert. He made himself some dinner, though he barely tasted it. His stomach was still tied up in knots. He kept his rifle close, loaded and ready, even though he knew it was mostly for comfort. What good would one rifle do against 200 warriors? As night deepened, Thomas finally allowed himself to relax slightly. The Apache rarely attacked at night. They believed the darkness belonged to spirits, and that dying at night meant your soul might wander forever without finding peace. Thomas had learned this from an Apache trader years ago, back when relations between the two peoples hadn't been quite so bloody. He dozed in his chair, jerking awake at every sound. An owl hooted somewhere in the darkness. A coyote howled in the distance. His horse moved around in the barn. Each sound made his heart race until he identified it as harmless. Around midnight, Dahana cried out in her sleep. Thomas hurried to her room and found her tangled in the blankets, caught in another fever dream even though her fever had broken. He gently freed her from the twisted fabric and spoke softly until she calmed down. She opened her eyes briefly, saw him, and said something in Apache. Her tone was gentler than before, less frightened. Then she closed her eyes again and drifted back to sleep. Thomas returned to his chair and watched the darkness beyond his windows. He thought about his wife and what she would say about all this. She'd always believed in helping people, regardless of who they were or where they came from. "We're all just trying to survive in this hard land," she used to say. "The color of our skin doesn't change that." Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Thomas stood and stretched his sore muscles, then walked outside to watch the sunrise. The moment he stepped onto the porch, he saw that the warriors were still there. They'd stayed all night maintaining their silent vigil, but now something was different. As Thomas watched, the line of warriors parted slightly. A single rider separated from the group and began making his way down from the ridge. Thomas's mouth went dry. This was it. Whatever came next was about to begin. The rider was the medicine man, Dahana's father. Thomas recognized him by his decorated clothing and the way he carried himself. The old man rode slowly, deliberately, giving Thomas plenty of time to see him coming. Thomas stepped off the porch and walked a few yards from the house, stopping in the open where he could be clearly seen. He kept his hands visible and away from any weapons. If this was going to go bad, he didn't want to be the one who started it. The medicine man reached the bottom of the ridge and continued toward the ranch. He was alone, which Thomas took as either a good sign or a very bad one. Either the man trusted Thomas not to harm him, or he didn't care what happened to himself as long as justice was done for his daughter. As the medicine man got closer, Thomas could see his face more clearly. The man looked old, maybe in his 60s, with deep lines carved into his weathered skin. His eyes were dark and sharp, missing nothing. He wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with symbols that Thomas didn't understand, along with feathers and beads that marked him as someone important. The medicine man stopped his horse about 20 feet away from Thomas. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other. Thomas could feel his heart pounding so hard he thought the old man must surely be able to hear it. Then the medicine man spoke. His voice was surprisingly strong for someone his age, and his words came in Apache. Thomas caught a few words he recognized, but not enough to understand the full meaning. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, feeling helpless. "I don't speak Apache well. I found your daughter by the creek. She was very sick. I've been trying to help her." The medicine man's expression didn't change. He sat his horse in silence, studying Thomas with those sharp eyes. Thomas felt like he was being looked at not just as a man, but as something deeper, like the medicine man was trying to see into his soul. Finally, the old man spoke again. This time, to Thomas's surprise, the words came in English. "You are Thomas Garrett," the medicine man said. His English was accented but clear. "You have lived alone since your woman died. You trade fairly with my people when others cheat. You do not shoot at us from your porch like your neighbors do." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. The Apache had been watching him, learning about him, long before his daughter had collapsed on his land. "Yes, sir," Thomas said, not sure what else to say. "That's all true." The medicine man dismounted with surprising grace for his age. He stood for a moment, then began walking toward Thomas. Every muscle in Thomas's body wanted to run or reach for a weapon, but he forced himself to stay still. The old man stopped directly in front of him. They were close enough now that Thomas extended his hand in greeting the way he would to any man. His hand trembled slightly, but he kept it steady and waited. The medicine man looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, instead of shaking it the white man's way, he grasped Thomas's forearm in the Apache manner. The old man's grip was strong and firm. He nodded once, a gesture that seemed to carry weight and meaning. Then he spoke in English again. "I am called Red Sky at Dawn," he said. "The girl is my daughter, my only living child. Her name is Dahana, which means she who brings light. Her brothers died fighting your people. She is all I have left." Thomas felt the enormous responsibility of those words settle on his shoulders. This man had already lost so much, and now his last child had nearly died on Thomas's land. "She's inside," Thomas said. "Her fever broke. She's weak, but I think she'll recover. Would you like to see her?" Red Sky at Dawn studied Thomas's face for another long moment. Then he nodded. Thomas led the way to the house, very aware of the medicine man walking behind him. He could feel the presence of all those warriors on the ridge, watching this moment unfold. Inside, Thomas led Red Sky to Dahana's room. The girl was awake, sitting up slightly against the pillows. When she saw her father, her eyes filled with tears. She said something in Apache that sounded both relieved and apologetic. Red Sky walked to the bed and placed his hand on his daughter's forehead, checking her temperature, the way parents have done since the beginning of time. He spoke to her in their language, his voice gentle in a way it hadn't been with Thomas. Dahana answered him at length, occasionally gesturing toward Thomas. The medicine man listened carefully, his face revealing nothing of what he was thinking. Thomas stood awkwardly near the door, feeling like an intruder in his own home. Finally, Red Sky turned to him. "My daughter says you found her when she had given up hope of living," the medicine man said. "She says you brought her to your home and cared for her like she was your own child. She says you gave water when she was dying of thirst and cool cloths when the fever burned her." "Any decent person would have done the same," Thomas replied. "No," Red Sky said firmly. "Many of your people would have left her to die. Some would have done worse. You risk the anger of your own people to help an Apache girl. This is not a small thing." Thomas didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Over the next hour, with Dahana translating when needed, a story emerged. Thomas learned that Dahana had been promised in marriage to the son of another medicine man from a different Apache band. It was meant to strengthen the alliance between two groups, create unity in dangerous times. But Dahana didn't want the marriage. She'd only met the young man once and found him cruel and boastful. When the wedding date was announced, she'd run away in the night, hoping to reach her grandmother's people who lived 3 territories away. "I thought grandmother would protect me," Dahana said in her halting English, tears running down her face. "I thought she would tell father I could choose my own path. But I got lost. Then I got sick. I fell down by the creek and knew I would die there." Red Sky's face was stern as he listened to his daughter's confession. But Thomas also saw pain there. The pain of a father who'd been trying to do what he thought was best and now realized his daughter had been so desperate, she'd risked death rather than accept his decision. She has brought dishonor to me, Red Sky said heavily. Running from a marriage promise is a serious thing. It has consequences for both our people and for the alliance we were trying to build. Thomas listened, beginning to understand the complicated politics he'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about a girl running away from home. It was about tribal relations, about honor, about promises made between leaders. What happens now? Thomas asked. Red Sky looked at his daughter, then at Thomas, then back at his daughter. I do not know, he admitted. This is a problem with no easy answer. Dahana cannot return home unmarried. That would be too great an insult to the other family, to the young man she was promised to. It could break the alliance, maybe even start fighting between our bands. But she can't marry someone who frightens her, Thomas protested. You think I do not know this? Red Sky's voice rose slightly. You think I want my daughter to be unhappy? But I am not just a father. I am a medicine man, a leader. My decisions affect many people, not just my own family. Dahana spoke up then, her voice weak but determined. She said something in Apache that made her father's expression soften slightly. What did she say? Thomas asked. Red Sky sighed deeply. She says that the spirits led her to your land for a reason, that her sickness and her rescue are part of a bigger plan. She says that you are a good man, and that the spirits would not have saved her through you if there was not a purpose to it. Thomas felt uncomfortable with the weight of that interpretation. I'm just a rancher, he said. I don't know anything about spirits or bigger plans. I just saw a sick girl who needed help. Sometimes that is exactly what the spirits require, Red Sky replied. Not great warriors or wise men, but simple goodness when it is needed most. The medicine man walked to the window and looked out at the distant ridge where his warriors waited. He stood there for a long time, thinking. Thomas and Dahana waited in silence, both of them sensing that something important was being decided. Finally, Red Sky turned back to them. I must call a council, he said. The elders must decide what is to be done. You have earned the right to speak at this council, Thomas Garrett. Your actions saved my daughter's life. That gives you a voice in her future. Thomas wasn't sure he wanted a voice in anyone's future but his own, but he recognized that he didn't really have a choice. He'd become part of this story the moment he'd lifted Dahana onto his horse. When? He asked. Tonight, Red Sky said. When the sun sets. The elders will come down from the ridge. We will make a fire in your yard and discuss what must be done. He spoke to Dahana in Apache. She nodded, looking scared but also determined. Red Sky gently touched her face, a moment of tenderness between father and daughter, then turned and walked out of the room. Thomas followed him to the front door. Before leaving, the medicine man turned back to Thomas. My daughter tells me you lost your own woman 3 winters ago, he said, that you understand what it is to be alone, to have grief that does not heal. She says she saw this sadness in your eyes when you cared for her. Thomas swallowed hard. He didn't like talking about his wife, even after 3 years. Yes, he said simply. Sometimes, Red Sky said slowly, the spirits bring people together in strange ways. They create bridges between worlds that seem impossibly far apart. Tonight we will see if such a bridge can be built, or if the distance is too great. With that mysterious statement, the medicine man mounted his horse and rode back toward the ridge. Thomas watched him go, his mind spinning with questions and worries. He went back inside to check on Dahana. She was sitting up now, looking stronger despite her ordeal. She watched him approach with careful eyes. Are you afraid? She asked in English. Yes, Thomas admitted. Aren't you? Very afraid, she said. My father is angry with me. The elders will be angry too. I have caused many problems. Thomas sat down in the chair beside her bed. You were trying to take control of your own life, he said. That's not something to be ashamed of. Maybe the way you did it wasn't perfect, but I understand why you ran. Dahana looked at him with surprise. White men usually think women should obey fathers, obey husbands. Some do, Thomas agreed. But my wife taught me different. She said that women have just as much right to choose their path as men do. She said that forcing someone into a life they don't want is a kind of death, even if the body keeps living. Tears welled up in Dahana's eyes again. Your wife sounded wise. She was, Thomas said, his voice rough with old grief. Smarter than me by half and brave in ways I'll never be. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Dahana said something that surprised Thomas. The young man I was promised to, she said hesitantly. He said women are for working and making babies. He said I talked too much, that I asked too many questions. He said he would teach me to be quiet and obedient. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest. Did he threaten you? Not with words, Dahana said. But yes, I saw it in his eyes. He looked at me like I was a horse that needed breaking. I knew that if I married him, something in me would die. The part that asks questions, that wants to understand the medicine ways like my father, that wants to be more than just a worker. Then you were right to run, Thomas said firmly. Even if it caused problems, even if it made people angry. You were right to try to save yourself, Dahana smiled weakly. I hope the elders see it that way. Thomas hoped so too, but he wasn't counting on it. In his experience, old men in power rarely liked it when young people challenged tradition. Whether they were white elders or Apache elders probably didn't make much difference in that regard. As the day wore on, Thomas tried to prepare for the evening council. He had no idea what to expect, but he figured having coffee and food available couldn't hurt. He also made sure Dahana was comfortable and had everything she needed. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. Thomas stood on his porch and watched as figures began moving on the ridge. The afternoon shadows stretched long across the desert as Thomas watched the ridge. The Apache warriors who had been sitting still as statues for almost 2 full days were finally moving. But they weren't all coming down. Instead, small groups were breaking off and descending the slope. Thomas counted maybe 15 or 20 riders making their way toward his ranch. The rest stayed on the ridge, still watching, still waiting. These weren't young warriors coming down. Even from a distance, Thomas could tell these were older men, their movements deliberate and measured. He went inside to tell Dahana. She was sitting up in bed, looking much stronger than she had that morning. The rest and care had done her good, though she was still too weak to stand for long. Your father is coming, Thomas said. And others. The elders, I think. Dahana's face went pale. I should be there, she said, trying to push herself out of bed. I cannot hide like a child while they decide my fate. Thomas helped her stand, supporting her weight when her legs wobbled. Are you sure you're strong enough? I must be, she said with determination. This is my life they will discuss. I must face them with courage, not hide in a bed. Together they made their slow way to the front of the house. Thomas brought out chairs for them both and they sat on the porch waiting. Dahana wrapped a blanket around her shoulders against the cooling evening air. The riders reached the bottom of the ridge and crossed the open ground toward Thomas's ranch. As they got closer, Thomas could see more details. These men were indeed elders, their faces marked by age and experience. Some had gray in their long hair. Others bore the scars of old battles. All of them rode with a dignity that demanded respect. Red Sky at dawn rode at the front, his ceremonial clothing even more elaborate than before. He'd painted his face with designs that Thomas didn't recognize, and he wore a headdress decorated with eagle feathers. The other elders were similarly dressed, though none quite as ornately as Red Sky. They stopped about 30 feet from the house and dismounted. Red Sky said something in Apache, and the elders began gathering wood from the brush nearby. Within minutes, they had built a fire ring in Thomas's yard. They arranged themselves in a circle around where the fire would be, leaving spaces for Thomas, Dahana, and Red Sky. The medicine man approached the porch alone. He looked at his daughter, and something complicated passed between them. Love, disappointment, worry, all mixed together in a single glance. Can you walk to the fire? He asked her in English. Yes, father, Dahana replied, lifting her chin. Thomas helped her down from the porch. She leaned on him heavily, but insisted on walking under her own power as much as possible. They made their way to the circle slowly, and the elders watched their approach in silence. Red Sky indicated where they should sit. Thomas found himself between Dahana and an older Apache man whose face looked like it had been carved from ancient wood. The man didn't acknowledge Thomas's presence, just stared straight ahead at the unlit fire. When everyone was seated, Red Sky struck a spark and lit the kindling. The fire caught quickly in the dry wood, flames dancing up into the darkening sky. Smoke rose in a thin column, carrying the smell of burning mesquite. The medicine man stood and began speaking in Apache. His voice rose and fell in what sounded like a formal speech or prayer. The other elders listened intently, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of agreement. Thomas sat quietly, having no idea what was being said. He noticed that Dahana's hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. After Red Sky finished speaking, another elder stood. This one was perhaps the oldest of them all, his face so wrinkled that his eyes were nearly hidden in the folds of skin. But his voice was strong and clear as he spoke at length in Apache. This continued for some time, different elders standing to speak. Thomas tried to read their body language and tone, but it was difficult. Some seemed angry, their gestures sharp and emphatic. Others spoke more calmly, making measured points that the circle considered carefully. Finally, Red Sky spoke again, this time in English. He was looking directly at Thomas. "The elders have heard about what happened," he said. "They know you found my daughter dying and brought her to your home. They know you cared for her when you could have left her or done worse. This has been noted and is important." Thomas nodded, not sure if he was supposed to speak or stay silent. "But there are larger questions," Red Sky continued. "My daughter ran from a marriage promise. This is not a small thing. The other family feels insulted. The young man she was promised to feels shamed. There is talk that the alliance between our bands might break because of this." One of the elders spoke up in English, surprising Thomas. "Young people do not understand the cost of their choices," the old man said, his voice rough with age. "A girl's pride is not worth war between our people." Dahana started to speak, but her father held up his hand to stop her. "You will have a chance to speak," he said. "But first others must be heard." Another elder stood. He spoke in Apache, but Red Sky translated for Thomas. "He says that in the old days this would be simple. A girl who ran from a marriage promise would be returned to her father, and he would decide her punishment. The marriage would happen whether she wanted it or not, because the good of the people comes before the wishes of one person." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. That didn't sound good for Dahana, but then another elder spoke up, disagreeing. Red Sky translated again. "She says that times are changing. Our people are being pushed into smaller and smaller spaces by the white man's expansion. We cannot afford to treat our daughters like property to be traded. We need our young women to be strong and brave, not broken and obedient. Otherwise, how will they raise strong children to carry on our ways?" The debate went back and forth for what felt like hours. The fire burned lower and then was built up again. Stars appeared in the darkening sky above them. Thomas listened to it all, understanding some parts through translation and guessing at others through tone and gesture. Several things became clear. First, the elders were genuinely divided on what to do. This wasn't a simple decision with an obvious answer. Second, Red Sky's position as medicine man and his daughter's father put him in a difficult spot. He had to balance his love for Dahana with his responsibilities to his people. And third, Thomas's role in saving Dahana had given him an unexpected place in these discussions, though he still wasn't sure exactly what that meant. Finally, Red Sky called for Dahana to speak. She struggled to her feet, and Thomas stood to help her stay upright. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and began speaking in Apache. Her voice was weak at first, but it grew stronger as she continued. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the passion in them. She spoke for several minutes, and the elders listened without interruption. When she finished and sat back down, she was trembling. Thomas wanted to ask what she'd said, but this didn't seem like the time. Red Sky turned to Thomas. "My daughter has told the council her reasons for running. She has spoken of her fears about the marriage and what kind of life she would have had. She has also spoken of her gratitude to you, and of something she noticed while she was in your care." "What did she notice?" Thomas asked. "She says that you are lonely," Red Sky replied. "That your house carries the sadness of someone who has lost their partner. She says that you cared for her the way a father cares for a daughter, but also that you treated her like a person worthy of respect, not like property or a burden." Thomas felt his face grow warm. He hadn't realized Dahana had noticed so much while she was sick. One of the female elders spoke up then, and Red Sky translated. "She asks if you have children of your own." "No," Thomas said. "My wife and I wanted children, but we were never blessed with them." The elders murmured among themselves at this information. Then one of them spoke directly to Thomas in broken English. "You good man," the elder said. "Save girl when not have to. Risk anger of own people. This means something. Question is, what does it mean?" Before Thomas could respond, another elder stood and began speaking rapidly in Apache. Whatever he was saying, it caused a stir among the others. Some nodded enthusiastically. Others looked shocked. A few began arguing back. Red Sky held up his hands for silence. When the circle quieted, He turned to Thomas with an expression that was impossible to read. "One of our elders has made a proposal," Red Sky said carefully. "It is unusual. Very unusual. But it might solve several problems at once." "What kind of proposal?" Thomas asked, though something in the medicine man's tone made him nervous. Red Sky took a deep breath. "In Apache tradition, when a man saves a person's life, he becomes responsible for that life in a spiritual way. They are connected. You saved my daughter's life. This creates a bond, whether you intended it or not." "Okay," Thomas said slowly, not sure where this was going. "Dahana cannot return home unmarried," Red Sky continued. "This would dishonor our family and break the alliance. But she also cannot be forced to marry the young man she fears. That would break her spirit. And as one of our elders pointed out, we need strong women, not broken ones." Red Sky paused, looking between Thomas and his daughter. "The elder proposes that you could marry Dahana. This would fulfill the requirement that she marries. It would preserve our honor because she would be married to a man of—" Thomas sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. Marriage to Dahana? The idea seemed impossible, absurd even. She was young enough to be his daughter. They came from completely different worlds. They barely spoke the same language. But as he looked around the circle at the serious faces of the elders, he realized they weren't joking. This was a genuine proposal, one they were considering carefully. Dahana looked equally shocked. She stared at her father with wide eyes, then at Thomas, then back at her father. She said something in Apache that sounded like a protest. Red Sky responded to her firmly but not unkindly. Thomas caught a few words he recognized, something about honor and responsibility. The medicine man then turned back to the circle and spoke at length in Apache. The debate resumed, but now it had a different focus. The elders were discussing the marriage proposal from every angle. Some seemed in favor of it. Others clearly had concerns. Thomas listened to the rise and fall of their voices, understanding nothing but feeling the weight of the decision they were making. An older woman elder spoke up, and Red Sky translated for Thomas. "She says that marriage between Apache and white is not forbidden, but it is rare and difficult. The two worlds do not mix easily. There would be challenges." "That's putting it mildly," Thomas muttered. Another elder pointed out, through translation, that Thomas had already proven himself different from other white settlers. He didn't shoot at Apache on sight. He traded fairly. He had shown kindness when it wasn't required. Perhaps he could learn Apache ways, could become a bridge between the peoples. But then another elder raised concerns. "What about the young man she was promised to?" Red Sky translated. "His family will still feel insulted. This could still break the alliance, just in a different way." The discussion went on for another hour. Thomas's mind was spinning. Part of him wanted to simply refuse, to say this was all too crazy and send them away. But another part of him understood the complexity of the situation they were all trapped in. If Dahana returned home unmarried, she'd be forced to marry the man she feared, or her father would lose honor and the alliance would break. Either way, she'd be destroyed. But if Thomas married her, it solved the immediate problem while creating a dozen new ones. Finally, Red Sky stood and spoke to the circle with clear authority. The elders quieted and listened. When he finished, several nodded slowly. Others still looked uncertain, but they didn't argue. The medicine man turned to Thomas and Dahana. "The council has decided that this marriage proposal has merit," he said. "But it cannot be forced on either of you. You both must agree to it freely, understanding what it means." He looked at his daughter. "Dahana, if you marry this man, you will live in his world as much as ours. You will face judgment from both sides. Some Apache will call you a traitor for marrying white. Some whites will treat you with cruelty and contempt. It will not be easy." Dahana nodded, her face serious. Red Sky turned to Thomas. "And you, Thomas Garrett, if you marry my daughter, you take on responsibilities to her and to our people. You cannot just take her as property as some white men do with their wives. You must respect her, teach her, learn from her, and you must accept that she will always be Apache, that this part of her cannot and should not be erased." "I would never want to erase who she is," Thomas said quietly. "Words are easy," Red Sky replied. "Living them is harder. There will be times when you want her to act more white, to hide her Apache ways to make your life easier. You must resist this. She must be allowed to be fully herself." Thomas thought about his wife and how she'd always insisted on being her own person. even when other ranchers' wives thought she was too independent. He loved that about her, her refusal to fit into the small box the world wanted to put her in. "I understand," he said. One of the elders spoke up, wanting clarification about something. Red Sky conversed with him in Apache, then turned back to Thomas. "He wants to know if you would beat her if she displeased you. This is important. Among our people, a man who beats his wife is considered weak and cowardly. Is this also true in your world?" "Some men think it's their right," Thomas admitted. "But I'm not one of them. I've never hit a woman in my life, and I'm not about to start now." The elder nodded approvingly at the translation. Red Sky addressed the circle again in Apache. A few more questions were asked and answered. Then the medicine man called for a show of agreement. One by one, the elders indicated their support for the marriage proposal. Not all of them looked happy about it, but they agreed it was the best solution to an impossible problem. "The council approves," Red Sky announced. "But again, you both must choose freely. Dahana, daughter, what is your decision?" Dahana was quiet for a long moment. Thomas could see her thinking hard, weighing everything. Finally, she spoke in English so Thomas could understand. "I do not love this man," she said honestly. "I do not know him well, but I see his kindness. I see his respect for me even when I was weak and helpless. I see his loneliness and his good heart." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "The man I was promised to would have crushed my spirit. This man, I think, would let me grow. So yes, I choose this marriage, not because I am forced, but because I believe it is the best path forward for everyone." All eyes turned to Thomas. He felt the weight of their expectation, the hope that he would say yes and solve this crisis. But he also felt the weight of the commitment being asked of him. "Can I speak with Dahana privately?" he asked. "Just for a few minutes?" Red Sky looked like he wanted to refuse, but then he nodded. "Be quick. The night grows late and decisions must be made." Thomas stood and helped Dahana to her feet. They walked a short distance away from the fire, far enough that they couldn't be easily overheard but still visible to the watching elders. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked quietly. "Really sure? Because once we agree, there's no going back." "I am sure that I do not want to marry the other man," Dahana replied. "And I am sure that staying unmarried is not an option. So the question is not whether I am sure about you specifically, but whether this is better than the alternatives. And yes, I think it is." "That's not exactly a ringing endorsement," Thomas said with a slight smile. Dahana smiled back. "Tired but genuine. Would you prefer I lie and say I am deeply in love with you?" "No," Thomas admitted. "I'd prefer honesty." "Then here is my honesty," Dahana said. "You are old enough to be my father. We come from different worlds. This marriage will be hard, maybe impossible, but you saved my life when you did not have to. You cared for me with kindness. You treat me like a person, not property. These things matter more than romance." She looked back at the fire where the elders waited. "My father is a good man, but he is trapped between his love for me and his duty to our people. This marriage frees him from that trap. It gives me a life I can control, at least partly, and maybe, if we are both willing to try, we can build something good from this strange beginning." Thomas thought about his empty house, his lonely days, the way time seemed to stretch on without purpose since his wife died. He thought about the young woman standing beside him, brave enough to run toward an uncertain future rather than accept a life that would destroy her. "All right," he said, "but we need to set some ground rules between us, things the council doesn't need to know about." "Like what?" Dahana asked. "Like this is a partnership, not a master and servant situation," Thomas said. "We're equals in this house, in this marriage. You have just as much say as I do about how we live." Dahana nodded. "I agree. What else?" "You keep your language, your traditions, your ways," Thomas continued. "I won't ask you to give up being Apache. And you teach me. Help me understand your culture better. And you will teach me more about your world," Dahana added. "Not to replace my own, but to understand it. To survive in it." "Deal," Thomas said. "One more thing, though. I'm not expecting. We don't have to." He felt his face grow hot, stumbling over the words. Dahana understood what he was trying to say. "You mean sharing a bed," she said bluntly, making him blush even harder. "We are adults. We can speak plainly about such things." "Right," Thomas managed. "I just want you to know I'm not expecting anything like that. Not until and unless you want it. This marriage is about solving a problem, not about me taking advantage of you." Something in Dahana's expression softened. "That is good to know," she said. "And honest. I appreciate honesty." They stood in silence for a moment, both of them aware they were about to make a decision that would change everything. "Are we really doing this?" Thomas asked. "I think we are," Dahana replied. "Are you afraid?" "Terrified," Thomas admitted. "Me too," Dahana said. "But maybe being afraid together is better than being afraid alone." They walked back to the circle, holding on to each other for support, both physical and emotional. The elders watched them approach, their weathered faces revealing nothing. Red sky stood as they reached the fire. "What have you decided?" Thomas took a deep breath. "We've talked it through. We understand what we're agreeing to. And yes, we'll do it. We'll marry." A murmur went through the circle, some approving, some still uncertain, but the decision had been made. "Then there are details to arrange," Red Sky said. "The marriage ceremony must honor both Apache traditions and white traditions. We will need 3 days to prepare properly. During this time..." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity that left Thomas's head spinning. His quiet, lonely ranch had suddenly become the center of attention for both Apache and white settlers in the territory, and neither side seemed particularly happy about what was happening. Grandmother Willow proved to be a force of nature despite her advanced age. She took over Thomas's kitchen like a general commanding troops, rearranging everything to suit her needs. She cooked strange foods that smelled wonderful, prepared medicines from plants Thomas had never paid attention to, and chanted songs in Apache that seemed to fill the house with an energy it had lacked for years. Dahana grew stronger each day under the old woman's care. By the second day, she was walking around the house without help, though she still tired easily. Grandmother Willow fussed over her constantly, making her drink bitter teas and eat special foods meant to restore strength. Thomas found himself learning more about Apache customs than he'd ever imagined. Grandmother Willow spoke almost no English, but she communicated through gestures, demonstrations, and occasional translations from Dahana. He learned about the significance of different colors in Apache ceremonies, about the importance of the 4 directions, about prayers to the spirits of earth and sky. On the second day, Red Sky returned with several other Apache, bringing gifts. There were beautifully woven blankets, pottery decorated with intricate designs, herbs and medicines, and a stunning ceremonial dress for Dahana to wear during the wedding. "These are from our people," Red Sky explained. "Gifts to honor the marriage and to show respect for the union being created." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the generosity. "I don't have anything like this to give in return," he said. "You have already given the greatest gift," Red Sky replied. "My daughter's life. But there will be other exchanges during the ceremony. You will provide cattle for a feast and you will make promises before both our peoples. That is enough." But the Apache weren't the only visitors. On the afternoon of the second day, 3 of Thomas's neighbors rode up to his ranch. He recognized them immediately. Johnson, whose son had died in an Apache raid, Patterson, who ran a larger ranch to the south, and Wilson, who owned the general store in the nearest town. Thomas met them outside, not inviting them into the house where Dahana and Grandmother Willow were preparing ceremonial items. "Thomas," Johnson said without greeting, "we need to talk about what you're doing here." "What I'm doing is getting married," Thomas replied, keeping his voice even. "Don't see how that's anyone's business but mine." "You're marrying an Apache," Patterson spat the words like they were poison. "That makes it everyone's business. It makes you a traitor to your own people." Thomas felt anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "My people? And who exactly are my people? Because last time I checked, I'm just a rancher trying to live my life in peace, same as everyone else out here." "You can't seriously be defending this," Johnson said, his face red. "These savages killed my boy. They've raided our ranches, stolen our cattle, murdered our friends. And you're going to marry one of them?" "The girl I'm marrying didn't kill your son," Thomas said firmly. "She was probably just a child when that happened. You can't hold her responsible for everything every Apache has ever done, any more than she can hold me responsible for everything white settlers have done to her people." "That's exactly the kind of thinking that will get us all killed," Wilson interjected. "You're giving them a foothold on your land. You're inviting them into our community. What happens when they use your ranch as a base to launch raids?" "That's not going to happen," Thomas said. "You can't know that." Johnson shouted. "You're thinking with your..." He stopped himself, but the implication was clear. Thomas took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "Careful," he said quietly. "Think real carefully about what you're about to say about the woman I'm going to marry." The three men exchanged glances. Wilson spoke up, his tone trying to be reasonable. "Look, Thomas, we understand you've been lonely since your wife passed. We get that. But this isn't the answer. There are good white women who would marry you, women from town or from other ranches. You don't have to do this." "I'm not doing this because I'm lonely," Thomas replied, though that wasn't entirely true. "I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. That girl nearly died on my land. I saved her life. Now there are consequences to that, and I'm willing to face them." "Consequences," Patterson sneered. "Is that what you call sleeping with an Apache?" Thomas moved before he could think about it, grabbing Patterson by his shirt front. "I told you to watch your mouth about her," he growled. Johnson and Wilson pulled them apart. Patterson stumbled back, anger and surprise on his face. "This is what they've done to you already," Johnson said. "Turned you against your own kind. You're choosing them over us, Thomas. You need to understand what that means." "I understand perfectly," Thomas said, his voice cold. "It means you three can get off my land and not come back until you can speak with respect about my wife." "She's not your wife yet," Wilson pointed out. "Close enough," Thomas replied. "Now go." The three men mounted their horses, but before they left, Johnson turned back one last time. "You're making a mistake, Thomas," he said. "A mistake you're going to regret. Don't come running to us when it all falls apart. Don't expect our help when your Apache friends turn on you. You've made your choice, and you'll have to live with it." They rode away, leaving Thomas standing in his yard, shaking with anger and something else. Fear maybe, or doubt. Because what if they were right? What if he was making a terrible mistake? He turned to find Dahana standing in the doorway. She'd heard everything. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I am causing you to lose your friends." "They weren't really friends if they can't respect my decisions," Thomas replied, though the words felt hollow. The truth was, those men had been his neighbors for years. They'd helped each other during hard times, celebrated together during good times. Losing their friendship hurt no matter what he told himself. Dahana walked over to him. She was wearing a simple dress, her long black hair loose around her shoulders. She looked young and vulnerable, and Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle even heavier on his shoulders. "You can still change your mind," she said. "I would not blame you. This is harder than we thought it would be." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the strength that had carried her through running away and nearly dying. He saw someone who deserved a chance at a good life, not to be forced into a marriage that would break her spirit. "No," he said, "I'm not changing my mind. Those men will come around or they won't. Either way, we're doing this." Relief flickered across Dahana's face. "Thank you," she said simply. The third day arrived with perfect weather. The sky was clear and blue, and a gentle breeze kept the heat from being oppressive. Apache began arriving at dawn, setting up for the ceremony. They brought more food, more gifts, and began preparing the area around Thomas's ranch for the wedding. Red Sky directed everything with calm authority. He'd painted his face with ceremonial designs and wore his finest clothing. Other medicine people had come as well, both men and women, each with their own role to play in the ceremony. A few white settlers showed up too, though not many. Most were people who traded regularly with the Apache and understood the politics of what was happening. They kept their distance from the Apache guests, clustering together in their own group, but at least they'd come. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. It combined Apache traditions with a few white customs, creating something entirely unique. There were prayers in both languages, offerings to the spirits and to God, exchanges of gifts and promises. Dahana looked stunning in her ceremonial dress. The garment was made of soft deerskin, decorated with beads and quills in intricate patterns. Her hair had been braided with feathers and flowers woven through it. She stood tall and proud, every inch an Apache woman, and Thomas felt a strange mixture of awe and terror at what they were doing. When it came time for Thomas to make his vows, Red Sky translated them into Apache so everyone could understand. "I promise to honor Dahana," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "to respect her traditions and her people, to protect her and provide for her, to never raise my hand to her in anger, to let her be who she is without trying to change her into something she's not." Red Sky translated each line, and the Apache guests nodded their approval. Dahana's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she listened. Then it was her turn. She spoke first in Apache, then repeated her vows in English for the white guests. "I promise to be a good wife to Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness, "to help him understand my people's ways, to work beside him and build a life together, to bring honor to both my father's house and my husband's house, to be strong when he needs strength and gentle when he needs comfort." The ceremony continued with more prayers and rituals. They shared food and drink, symbolizing the joining of their lives. Red Sky tied their hands together with a woven cord, speaking about the bonds they were creating. An Apache elder woman sang a blessing song that made many in the crowd wipe their eyes. Finally, Red Sky pronounced them married in both Apache and English. The first weeks of marriage were awkward in ways Thomas hadn't anticipated. He and Dahana circled each other like cautious animals, polite and careful, neither wanting to overstep boundaries they hadn't quite figured out yet. Dahana took over parts of the household work, but not in the way Thomas expected. She didn't just cook and clean. She reorganized everything with a practical efficiency that actually made life easier. She showed him better ways to preserve food, how to treat minor injuries with plants that grew right on his property, how to read weather signs he'd never paid attention to before. In return, Thomas taught her about running the ranch. She learned to ride horses better, to mend fences, to understand the needs of cattle. She was a quick learner, asking questions constantly, never satisfied with simple answers. "Why do we move the cattle here and not there?" she'd ask, pointing at different sections of land. "Because this area has better grass," Thomas would explain. "But why is the grass better? The water drains differently, I guess. Makes the soil richer. Then we should dig channels to bring water to the other areas too." And Thomas would realize she was right, that he'd been doing things a certain way, simply because that's how he'd always done them, never thinking about how they could be improved. The hardest part was dealing with the outside world. When Thomas rode into town for supplies, he faced cold stares and whispered comments. Some shopkeepers served him reluctantly. Others refused his business entirely. Wilson, who owned the general store, told him to his face that he wasn't welcome anymore. "You made your choice," Wilson said. "Live with it somewhere else." Thomas had to travel to the next town over for basic supplies, adding hours to trips that used to be simple. It stung more than he wanted to admit. Dahana faced even worse treatment. The few times she accompanied Thomas to town, white women pulled their children away from her. Men made crude comments just loud enough for her to hear. Once someone threw a rock that hit her shoulder, leaving a bruise. After that, Thomas didn't bring her to white settlements anymore. It wasn't worth the pain and anger it caused them both. But the Apache side wasn't entirely welcoming either. Some of Dahana's people saw her marriage to a white man as a betrayal. When she visited her father's camp, certain women wouldn't speak to her. Young warriors looked at her with contempt as if she'd abandoned them. "They call me white man's woman, like it's a curse," Dahana told Thomas one evening, tears streaming down her face. "They say I have forgotten who I am, that I am no longer truly Apache." Thomas held her while she cried, feeling helpless and angry. "You haven't forgotten anything," he said. "You're still the same person you've always been." "Am I, though?" Dahana asked. "Sometimes I don't know anymore. I live in a white man's house, sleep under a white man's roof, follow white man's schedules. How much can I change before I'm not myself anymore?" It was a question Thomas didn't have a good answer for. But slowly, gradually, something started to shift. A few Apache began visiting the ranch, not for ceremonies or councils, but just to trade or talk. They brought items to sell and took back cattle or tools in exchange. Dahana served as translator and negotiator, and Thomas made sure the trades were always fair. Word spread that Thomas Garrett's ranch was a safe place for Apache to do business. Some of the younger men started asking him about cattle ranching, curious about this white man way of raising animals. Thomas taught them what he knew, and in return they taught him about hunting techniques and tracking that made managing his land easier. One day, about 2 months into the marriage, an Apache woman showed up with her sick child. The boy had a terrible cough and struggled to breathe. She'd heard that Dahana knew medicine ways, and she was desperate. Dahana worked through the night, using the healing knowledge her father had taught her combined with some remedies Thomas's late wife had left behind. By morning, the child's fever had broken and he was breathing easier. The mother cried with relief and gratitude. She spread word through the Apache community that Dahana's medicine was powerful, that she could heal with wisdom from both worlds. More people came after that. Apache with injuries or illnesses, but also, surprisingly, a few white settlers. A rancher's wife who'd heard whispers about the Apache woman who could heal things regular doctors couldn't. A farmer whose infected hand wasn't responding to normal treatment. Dahana helped them all, never turning anyone away regardless of who they were or what they could pay. Thomas built her a small workspace in one of the outbuildings where she could prepare medicines and treat patients. "You're building something here," Thomas told her one evening as they watched another grateful family leave their ranch. "Something important. We are building it," Dahana corrected. "Not just me. This only works because you support it, because you make people feel safe coming here." As summer turned to fall, their partnership deepened. The awkwardness faded into comfortable routine. They developed their own rhythms, their own way of communicating that mixed English and Apache and simple understanding. Thomas found himself looking forward to evenings when they'd sit on the porch together, Dahana teaching him Apache words while he taught her to read English better. She was determined to understand the written contracts and laws that govern the white world, knowing that ignorance could be used against her people. One evening, Dahana asked Thomas to teach her to write. They sat at the table with paper and pencil, and Thomas guided her hand through the shapes of letters. Her fingers were stiff and uncertain at first, but she persisted with the same determination she brought to everything. "Why is this so important to you?" Thomas asked. "Because knowledge is power," Dahana replied. "The white man uses paper and writing to take our lands, to make agreements we don't understand. If I can read and write, maybe I can help my people understand these things. Maybe I can protect them better." Thomas felt a surge of admiration for her. She wasn't just trying to survive in two worlds. She was trying to bridge them in ways that could actually help her people. Around this time, Red Sky at Dawn returned from his negotiations with the other Apache band. The visit had not gone smoothly, he reported, but he'd managed to preserve the alliance by offering substantial gifts and making certain promises. The young man Dahana had been promised to was angry, but his father had accepted the situation rather than risk open conflict. "It is not perfect," Red Sky admitted. "There is still bad feeling, but it will fade with time, especially as people see that your marriage brings benefits to both sides." The medicine man stayed for a few days, observing how his daughter and Thomas lived together. On his last evening, he spoke to Thomas privately. "I was worried," Red Sky admitted. "I feared my daughter would be miserable, that you would mistreat her or that she would wither away from loneliness and isolation. But I see something different. I see partnership. I see respect. I see two people building something new together." "It hasn't been easy," Thomas said honestly. "Good things rarely are," Red Sky replied, "but easy is not important. What matters is that you are both trying, both growing. My daughter is stronger now than when she married you. That is what a good marriage does." As winter approached, Thomas and Dahana faced their first major test. A group of white ranchers, led by Johnson and Patterson, started putting pressure on Thomas's neighbors not to do business with him. They tried to organize a boycott, to force Thomas to give up his Apache wife or leave the territory entirely. For a while, it looked like it might work. Several ranchers who'd been friendly stopped visiting. Thomas couldn't sell his cattle at the usual markets. Money got tight, but then something unexpected happened. The Apache band that Dahana's father led offered to buy Thomas's cattle directly. They needed beef to supplement their hunting, especially with game becoming scarce as more white settlers moved into the territory. The price they offered was fair, and it solved Thomas's immediate financial problem. More than that, it showed the white ranchers that their boycott wouldn't work. Thomas had access to markets they didn't, trade routes they couldn't match. Within weeks, some of the ranchers who'd supported the boycott were quietly asking if Thomas could help them sell to the Apache too. He agreed, but only on the condition that they treat his wife with respect when they visited his ranch. Most agreed. Those who didn't lost out on profitable trades. As Thomas's role as a bridge between Apache and white communities grew, so did his relationship with Dahana. The partnership they'd started with began transforming into something deeper. They laughed together more often. They touched casually in passing. They shared private jokes and memories. One cold December evening, they sat by the fire after a long day's work. Dahana was mending a shirt while Thomas read aloud from a newspaper that was 3 weeks old. It was a domestic scene, comfortable and ordinary in the best possible way. Dahana set down her mending and looked at Thomas for a long moment. "What?" he asked, noticing her gaze. "I was just thinking," she said slowly, "about the day you found me by the creek. I was sure I would die there. I had given up hope. You're here now," Thomas said. "That's what matters." "Yes, but it's more than just being alive," Dahana continued. "I thought my life was over when my father told me about the marriage arrangement. I thought my only choices were to accept a life I didn't want or to run away and probably die trying.